The clock hadn't even struck the start of morning when housekeeper Winifred Chapman arrived at the residence of acclaimed film director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate, on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles. Right at the entrance, something seemed out of place. Winifred noticed an electrical wire fallen on the ground. The wire was stretched out strangely, crossing the path to the gate as if someone had left it there in a hurry. Winifred pressed the gate button, and the mechanism responded normally, without failure or hesitation. She went in, picked up the morning newspaper, and headed into the residence through the back, as she usually did. Upon entering, the house was too quiet. Then, from inside the house, in the distance on the lawn, she saw the body of a woman. She then noticed bloodstains spreading and running throughout the entire interior of the residence, marking the path through the rooms. Hollywood would never be the same after that day. This time, we're going to explore the events of one of the most shocking cases of its era. An episode in which a man was able to spread his madness, created a bizarre cult, and fueled a prophecy of war and chaos as a kind of divine mission. And within this logic, murdering innocent people was just the beginning. It was already past 9:40 in the morning when the first officers from the Los Angeles Police Department arrived at the crime scene. Officer Jerry DeRosa was the first to head toward the residence. Right at the entrance, he came across a white Rambler Ambassador parked near the garage as if it had been left in a hurry. Inside the vehicle was the body of a young man. He would later be identified as Stephen Parent, 18 years old. The car was cold, a sign it hadn't been running for some time. Even so, the gear shift remained engaged in second gear. In the left rear seat, or on the passenger side, there was a wristwatch thrown with the strap broken. Stephen showed defensive wounds on the palm of his left hand, a clear sign he tried to protect himself from a bladed weapon, a reaction that possibly resulted in the watch strap being cut. The cause of death, however, was evident to Officer Jerry. He noticed gunshot marks on the victim's face, left arm, and chest. At that point, a second officer, William Weisenhunt, arrived at the residence and joined the observation alongside Jerry, assessing the scene next to him. The two decided to advance through the garage and search the other vehicles. It was at this moment that a third officer joined the search, expanding the sweep. The trio quickly came across a second body, visible near the pool and lawn of the residence. It was Wojciech Frykowski, 32, fallen in the open. The body showed several puncture wounds, including defensive wounds on the right hand, suggesting an attempt at restraint or escape. Advancing through the front garden of the residence, the officers found the body of Abigail Folger, 25. She was lying on her back with her clothing soaked in blood at chest level. Several puncture wounds were observed in the torso area. There were also cuts on her face and defensive wounds on both hands, indicating she resisted. Faced with the sequence of murders, the officers didn't know what to expect. They decided to enter the residence cautiously, alert to any sign of movement. To do this, Jerry and William entered through an open window on the side of the house, choosing an access point that allowed them to observe the interior. Meanwhile, the third officer went to the front door, where he found the word "pig" written in blood. After opening the front door for the third officer, the group advanced into the living room of the residence. There, they found two more victims in even more shocking conditions. The first was actress Sharon Tate, 26. She was lying in a fetal position in front of a sofa that faced the fireplace, as if she had been cornered there. A nylon rope had been tied around her neck and secured to one of the ceiling beams in the room. Officers noticed several puncture wounds in the chest area and a large puncture wound in the abdominal area and right leg. The scene got even worse when they realized Sharon was pregnant. The bloodstain patterns on the body seemed strange, suggesting the body had possibly been moved several times by the killer after the attack. The second victim there was identified as famous Hollywood hairstylist Jay Sebring, 35. He was lying on his side with a light-colored towel soaked in blood covering his head and face, as if someone had tried to hide the impact of the violence. The same rope tied to Sharon's neck extended across the room and was wrapped around Jay's neck. Like her, Jay had been stabbed to death, with evidence consistent with a direct and repeated attack. During the search of the residence, officers located the grip of a high-standard Longhorn .22 caliber revolver, which would become the main piece of evidence. Outside, with more officers arriving, several bloodstains were located throughout the residence, including on the electric button of the main gate, which indicated there had been movement between the interior and exterior areas. While searching the rest of the property, the voice of an unknown man echoed through the residence, along with a dog barking. The officers present at the crime scene went to the location, surrounded the man, and arrested him without giving him a chance to react. The subject identified himself as William Garretson, 19, the property caretaker. After isolating the crime scene, the case was handed over to the Los Angeles Homicide Unit, which set about reconstructing the last events inside the residence step by step, based on what was found. According to the findings, on the night of August 8, 1969, Sharon Tate decided to cancel her plans and stay home. By her side were Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski, two house guests who had occupied the place since March of that year, and who on that occasion were also spending the night there. That night, Sharon was expecting a visit from her hairstylist and ex-lover, Jay Sebring, who used to frequent the place and stay in contact with her. Weeks earlier, the young actress had returned from London, where she had spent a few days with her husband, director Roman Polanski. He would return to the United States only 3 days after that night, remaining out of the country during that period. The property that Sharon and Roman rented on Cielo Drive wasn't made up of a single residence, and the land had separate areas with internal circulation. To the south of that distinct area was the residence of the owner, Rudy Altobelli. That night, he was absent but had left the place under the care of William, responsible for monitoring basic activity on the property. Normally, the young caretaker's responsibilities didn't extend to the house rented by the Polanskis, which functioned as an independent area within the property. That night, around 11:45 p.m., he received a visit from his friend Stephen Parent. The two talked briefly for at most 20 minutes before Stephen prepared to leave. This was the timeline reconstructed by investigators. From this, they theorized that shortly after midnight, one or more still unidentified individuals approached the main gate of the property, possibly already with the intention of entering. From this point, three possible theories emerged. The first investigative line considered a planned action with prior interference in the property's infrastructure. In this hypothesis, the main cable at the top of a pole near the residence was cut. Also identified was the cutting of a two-conductor cable that connected the residence to the gate's communication system. This system, originally used for intercom interaction between the house and the entrance, hadn't been in use since the Polanskis began occupying the property in February 1969. Even so, the location and pattern of the cut suggested a deliberate attempt to isolate the property, reducing the possibility of external communication or remote gate activation. Within this hypothesis, the perpetrators would have accessed the property around 12:30 a.m. At that same moment, Stephen was leaving the property. The young man would have been the first victim, hit by gunshots while still in his vehicle. The attackers then headed to the main residence, where the other four murders occurred. There was a second hypothesis that considered a different scenario, associated with a possible illegal drug transaction. According to this theory, the suspects would have gone to the residence after midnight with the goal of delivering or receiving narcotics. An argument would have occurred inside the house, possibly motivated by some financial disagreement. The conflict then escalated to lethal violence with the use of a firearm and a bladed weapon against the residents. After the murders, the perpetrators would have left the residence and encountered Stephen at the moment he was leaving the property, making him the last victim, not the first. Subsequently, the suspects would have cut the telephone communication cables with the goal of delaying discovery of the crimes. The third investigative line, in contrast, started from the possibility of an attempted home robbery that culminated in the deaths of everyone in the main house. During the escape, the perpetrators would have encountered Stephen and eliminated him before leaving the location to avoid leaving witnesses. After the failed robbery attempt and leaving the location, those responsible would have cut the telephone and communication cables, again with the purpose of delaying discovery of the crime. victims. As you can see, the three hypotheses present differences regarding motivation, but converge on central details: the possibility of two or more killers, the isolation of the property, the combined use of weapons, and the elimination of all witnesses present. There were few certainties for the Los Angeles Police Department. Even so, in the early hours of that morning, authorities already knew they were dealing with one of the most shocking cases of their era, due to the sequence of events and the number of victims. The murders that occurred at Sharon and Roman's residence began receiving extensive press coverage in the hours following the discovery of the scene. However, at that initial stage, authorities' interpretation of the facts was still fragmented and inconsistent. Even so, the theory gaining the most traction in the media and among police considered the possibility of a connection to drug trafficking. This put caretaker William Garretson as the main suspect. In his testimony, he stated he hadn't seen or heard any unusual activity during the night of the murders. His version was later reinforced by a polygraph exam, which would culminate in his release. However, on the night following the murders on Cielo Drive, a new crime would catch the attention of the Los Angeles Police Department and heighten the sense of urgency. A couple, Leonel LaBianca and his wife Rosemary LaBianca, were returning from a trip accompanied by Susan Struthers, Rosemary's daughter. After dropping the young woman off at her apartment, the couple headed to the residence located at 3301 Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz neighborhood. During the trip, they were seen stopping to buy a newspaper in an apparently ordinary errand. That was the last time the couple would be seen alive. And the next day, around 8:30 in the evening, the couple's family would find their bodies inside the residence. Leno LaBianca was found lying down, dressed in pajamas, with his head covered by a cloth and an electrical cord wrapped around his neck. His hands were tied behind his back. There were clear signs of puncture wounds in his abdomen made with a sharp object. Rosemary LaBianca's body was located with the same characteristics seen with Leno in an equally violent scene. Beyond the physical violence, officers noticed messages written in blood at different points in the residence, which immediately caught attention at the scene. On the living room wall, the phrase "Death to Pigs" was observed. On another wall, the word "Rise" was found, written directly. And on the refrigerator door of the residence, the expression "Helter Skelter" with a spelling error was found. This expression meant confusion, disorder, or chaos, though it was also known as the title of a Beatles song, which gave the writing an additional meaning for those who knew it. The scene at the LaBianca family residence was notably strange, but it wasn't connected to the events on Cielo Drive at that first moment. Meanwhile, another case that occurred days earlier began drawing the attention of some police investigators. It seemed that on the night of July 31st of that year, 1969, music teacher Gary Hinman had been brutally murdered in his residence. At the crime scene, officers had identified the inscription "Political Piggy" made with the victim's blood on the living room wall. To those investigators, the phrase showed a direct similarity to the terms found at the Tate and LaBianca residences, both in vocabulary and apparent intent. Besides the inscription, there were similarities in the pattern of violence, with Gary being killed through multiple stab wounds. So they brought these facts to light, but those responsible for the investigations didn't establish a link between Gary's murder and the events on Cielo Drive. To make matters worse, Leno and Rosemary's murders were under the jurisdiction of the sheriff's department. With this, the cases continued being investigated separately by different teams, with the exception of those investigators. But nobody imagined the true connection the cases had. The murder that occurred at Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate's residence was, at that time, the main case being investigated by the Los Angeles police. With this, within the drug trafficking hypothesis, investigators managed to raise and list several suspects. The screening advanced quickly at first because there were many possible names to check. All of them were interrogated, and then, after confirming alibis and checking gathered evidence, each of them was excluded from the investigation. investigation. The reason was the same. No direct link to the murders was confirmed. Director Roman Polanski was also subjected to interrogation by authorities. He agreed to cooperate and consented to take a polygraph exam as part of the effort to clarify the facts and reduce doubts surrounding the case. On August 15th, Roman returned for the first time to the residence on Cielo Drive. It was a return marked by strong emotional impact. Upon arriving, he showed clear signs of being shaken, noticeable in his behavior and how he reacted to the environment. Additionally, Roman criticized the press coverage. At that point, newspapers and programs were already circulating speculation involving satanic ritual practices, drug use, and behaviors considered deviant on the part of the couple. For him, this type of narrative diverted focus from the essential and contributed to versions without concrete basis. Roman publicly contested these allegations and stated they didn't correspond to the facts. In testimony, Roman shared with investigators the belief that he himself could have been the target of the criminal action. He maintained this hypothesis by describing his perception of the context and the location where the crime occurred. A month later, with no progress in the investigations, Roman announced a $5,000 reward. The proposal was clear: pay for any information that resulted in the identification, arrest, and conviction of those responsible for the murders. However, this appeal didn't result in any progress and didn't produce concrete elements that changed the direction of the case. Meanwhile, Paul Tate, Sharon's father, was already conducting his own investigation. Due to his military experience, he began frequenting environments associated with the counterculture of the time. This included hippie communities and places known for drug circulation, with the goal of obtaining information that wasn't within the police's reach. Unfortunately, Paul also wasn't able to advance the investigations. Months passed, and the investigations continued fragmented between the Los Angeles Police Department and the County Sheriff's Department, until there was the arrest of hippie Robert Beausoleil, caught driving Gary Hinman's vehicle. After much pressure, he ended up confessing to the murder and mentioned political motivations. When Robert's life was examined, investigators ended up being led to the Spawn Ranch, located near Chatsworth. The location used to serve as a filming location for movie productions, especially Western films in previous decades. Investigators discovered the existence of a group of alternative people who considered themselves a family, the Manson family. Among the names considered of interest was that of Charles Manson, leader of the group. The direct link between the suspect and the community reinforced the hypothesis of more people's involvement. This resulted in the arrest of several members, still under the argument of illicit activities at the ranch. Among these same prisoners, one stood out: Susan Atkins. According to findings from the Sheriff's Department, Charles Manson had ordered Robert, accompanied by Susan, to go to Gary Hinman's residence with the direct goal of getting money. When he refused, Robert cut his face, and both kept him captive for a period until they decided to kill him. The story transformed Charles into a new and emblematic character, someone who now needed to be investigated with attention. So Susan, while awaiting trial for the case, was placed at the California Institution for Women, the female prison in Los Angeles, where she was detained. There, she shared an interesting story with fellow inmate Virginia Graham. According to Susan, it was she who stabbed Gary, not her partner Robert, as had been believed. Additionally, she confessed that her lover Charles Manson was Jesus Christ, and that he would take her to a hole in the earth in Death Valley, where there existed a hidden civilization. Susan also mentioned the Sharon Tate case and confessed she had participated in the murders that aimed to shock the world. Susan explained that at the time of the crime, there were 4 people, 3 girls and 1 man, all of whom had received instructions from her lover Charles. Susan told Virginia that after leaving Sharon's house, she realized she had left her fingerprint on a table, but believed her spirit was so strong that the fingerprint didn't show up in forensic analysis. Susan ended her story to Virginia by admitting they had also killed the LaBiancas. But while this was happening, investigators reached a man identified as Al Springer, member of the Straight Satan's motorcycle gang, who who had had involvement with the Manson family. Detectives were surprised when the man told them Charles Manson had bragged to him about killing 5 people and had left messages behind as a kind of signature. Al Springer also shared the name of Danny DiCarlo, a member of the motorcycle gang who lived at Spahn Ranch with the family. When Danny was located and interrogated, he confirmed the murder stories, including the death of a ranch hand he knew as Shorty. According to him, Shorty didn't like the things happening at the ranch and was willing to turn the Manson family into the owner, but was silenced before he could do that. Danny said Charles Manson hated informants and that this was a clear rule. It seems Shorty was killed and dismembered. When the Sheriff's Department investigators shared this information with the Los Angeles Police Department investigators, they ignored the story, treating it as secondary. On the other hand, the Sheriff's Department concentrated its investigation on the Manson family, believing the hippie cult was directly linked to the Sharon Tate, LaBianca, and Gary Hinman murder cases. Sometime later, Susan shared the same story with another inmate identified as Ronnie Howard, who tried to contact the Los Angeles Police Department but had her request denied several times. At that point, that first inmate, Virginia Graham, who had been transferred to another prison unit, faced the same type of difficulty trying to inform authorities about Susan and what she was saying. It was only on November 17, 1969, that finally 2 investigators from the LAPD Homicide Division were sent to interview her. Authorities hadn't been giving much importance to that lead until then, but that changed when Virginia shared everything with them in detail. After the interview, she was transferred to an isolation cell for her safety, and the Manson family would begin to be investigated more seriously. For the first time, everyone was looking at a single person, Charles Manson. But after all, who was this guy? Both the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department began digging into the past of the hippie leader, described as troubled and marked by successive stays in institutions. According to the findings, Charles was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was the son of Kathleen Maddox, who had him at 16. His father was never identified. She later briefly married William Manson, from whom Charles took the surname, officially adopting it as a family reference. Kathleen frequently consumed alcohol and was involved in illicit activities. At one point, she was convicted of armed robbery, which resulted in her imprisonment and left Charlie alone for a period. During these intervals, he was sent to different guardians, including close relatives, staying mainly with an aunt in West Virginia. Apparently, his family dynamic was characterized by religious repression from his maternal grandparents, especially his grandmother, which contributed to a rigid domestic environment. At age 9, Charlie was arrested for theft and sent to a juvenile reformatory. 3 years later, he was arrested again and transferred in 1947 to a boys' school in Indiana. After a year of confinement, he ran away and tried to find his mother, who refused to take him into her home, ending this attempt at return. From that point, Charles began living alone, surviving through theft and other minor crimes, which resulted in another arrest. Again, he was sent to an institution for boys, where only days later, at age 13, he participated in 2 armed robberies with another inmate. These new violent acts caused Charles to be transferred to another boys' institution in Indiana, where he would remain for 3 years. Reports described a suspicious and erratic teenager with adaptation difficulties and unstable behavior. In 1951, he escaped, this time accompanied by 2 other young men. The trio quickly headed to California, where they survived through petty theft and car robberies until they were arrested in Utah. After this detention, Charles was transferred to another boys' institution in Washington, continuing the cycle of institutionalization. During his stay at that institution, he was subjected to psychological evaluations. Tests indicated an IQ of 109, considered an average level. At the same time, he was classified as functionally illiterate with mediocre overall performance, except in music-related activities, where he showed greater talent. Charles was described as restless, frequently ill-tempered, and with a tendency to divert attention during common daily activities, maintaining low tolerance for routines. Still in 1951, he was evaluated by a psychiatrist who identified a profile marked by rejection, emotional instability, and a history of psychological trauma. However, Charles's profile also showed a constant search for recognition and status among other inmates. With a need to assert insert himself in the group, as well as the presence of contradictory characteristics such as manipulation ability used to influence situations in his favor. During his stay, Charlie became involved in an episode of serious violence against another inmate, using a razor blade to threaten him during an assault of a sexual nature. After this occurred, he was transferred to the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. At this institution, he began to be classified as a high-risk individual, considered dangerous and requiring constant supervision within the correctional system. In September 1952, Charles was transferred to a maximum security institution in Ohio. Reports from the time classified him as a sophisticated criminal for his age and unsuitable for open regime environments. Despite this assessment, there was a significant behavioral change. It was recorded that Charles began showing greater cooperation with institutional staff and made educational progress, acquiring basic reading and math skills. This performance contributed to him being granted parole in May 1954 at age 19. After release, he initially lived with relatives and, for a short period, with his mother in an attempt to reorganize his routine outside the system. In 1955, he married Rosalie Jean Willis. Some sources report she was 15 years old. They later had a son, Charles Manson Jr., marking the start of a new stage in Charles's personal life. During this period, he held low-paying jobs and supplemented his income with illicit activities, mainly car theft. One of these episodes resulted in his arrest after transporting a stolen car to Los Angeles. He was then sent to Terminal Island Prison in California. During his incarceration, his wife filed for divorce, increasing his personal isolation. Some years later, Manson was released on parole again. In the following months, he began working as a pimp and obtaining resources through exploitation of others and fraud, maintaining a routine associated with repeated crimes. A year later, he was arrested on federal charges related to theft and attempting to cash a stolen U.S. Treasury check. Despite the seriousness of the charges, he received another chance at parole after intervention from a young woman who claimed to be pregnant and requested clemency from the court. Even so, in the following months, he was detained again on suspicion of car theft and use of a stolen credit card, resuming the same pattern. At the end of that year, Charles got involved in new crimes, including financial fraud and serious assaults against people in his social circle. He tried to flee to Texas, but was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison. At age 26, he was transferred to the federal penitentiary on McNeil Island in the state of Washington. Internal reports describe a behavioral profile marked by a strong need for attention and recognition. According to records, Charles frequently resorted to negative conduct as a way to gain visibility, insisting on conflicts and provocative attitudes. During this period, he showed interest in different religions, including Scientology and Buddhism. However, records indicate this involvement was superficial and transitory, without consistency or depth. During that same period, Charles showed more curiosity about music and even mentioned he could become more famous than the Beatles. While imprisoned, he met a criminal named Alvin Karpis, who taught him to play guitar. With this, in mid-1966, Charles began composing songs, practicing other instruments, and showing strong interest in pursuing a musical career even within the prison environment. On March 21, 1967, he was released and sent to San Francisco. At age 32, he had spent more than half his life inside prisons, with long periods of confinement interspersed with quick returns to crime. Some records indicated Charles himself said he was afraid, claiming he was unable to adapt to society. Even so, he was released without that fear preventing the decision. Back on the streets, Charles found an alternative society with various groups and informal networks. He used his music to enter these groups, where he encountered psychoactive substances and young people who had run away from home or who were emotionally vulnerable. It seemed Charles understood the profile of these young people and used his persuasion skills along with drug use to unite followers and maintain constant closeness. In the spring of 1968, he and his group left San Francisco on a converted bus and began traveling around California, seeking new support points. At one point, part of the group was taken in by teacher Gary Hinman, whose residence would serve as a place of emotional support. It was through this contact that Charles met musician Dennis Wilson, who soon noticed strange behavior from the group. Through Wilson, Charles also met Terry Melcher, son of singer Doris Day. Investigators discovered that Terry had lived in the house on Cielo Drive, later occupied by Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. During the period of friendship, Charles reportedly visited the property several other times alongside Dennis Wilson, moving around the location on different occasions. Additionally, by that time, Charles and his followers had already found Spawn Ranch, where they would go to live with the owner's permission, who asked in exchange for daily chores to be done at the location. At the ranch, Charles began sharing his musical and especially philosophical ideas, speaking frequently and in a tone of guidance. He used a crazy combination of ideas, gathering concepts from various religions, including biblical texts, together with the use of the Beatles' White Album, all in order to create a message. He claimed the Beatles album had coded messages warning about an imminent racial war. The expression "helter skelter," present in one of the tracks, was incorporated as the main concept of his narrative. Charles claimed that he and his followers would survive isolated in desert regions and would later return to take control after this supposed war ended. According to the findings, investigators believed he wanted to trigger these prophecies, and to do this, he began planning murders. Authorities had all this information in hand, and thus the circle closed around Charles Manson. On November 18, 1969, Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi was assigned to lead the case related to the Tate and LaBianca murders. However, the structure of the case presented a legal challenge for the prosecution. It wasn't enough to show that members of the so-called Manson family had carried out the murders. It was necessary to establish consistently that Charles Manson had directly commanded the criminals and directed the group's actions. In the case of the murders committed on Cielo Drive, Charles wasn't present during the execution. Even so, the prosecution wanted to argue he had determined the motivation for the crimes even without physical participation at the location. In the LaBianca case, there was evidence of Charles's initial direct participation, including restraining the victims, followed by orders for other members to carry out the murders. Given this scenario, the prosecution's strategy required demonstrating two central elements presented in an articulated way throughout the trial. First, the level of control Charles exercised over the group's members. Second, the existence of motivation that justified carrying out the crimes, with some degree of internal occurrence to support the accusatory thesis. To support these points, the prosecution sought evidence from Charles's life, portraying him as a presence with strong psychological influence over the executors. Additionally, it pointed out that the members themselves showed strong signs of dependence and obedience to the group's leader in accounts and behaviors observed by investigators. Thus, the prosecution gathered several witnesses such as Susan Atkins, Al Springer, and Danny DiCarlo. There was also fragmented information obtained in interviews with individuals who had contact with Charles and the Manson family, even though part of this material wasn't fully cohesive at first. Even so, the final identification of those involved only occurred on December 3, 1969, when the prosecution managed to more precisely establish the names of those involved in the crimes. For the massacre at Sharon Tate's residence, Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian were identified. Charles Watson, then 23, was the only man present in that episode. Up to that point, his personal story was described as that of an ordinary boy, a Texan, marked by good academic performance and involvement in sports. This changed when he moved to California, where he encountered the hippie scene, and later Charles Manson, which would transform his trajectory. Patricia, then 21, had a long history of emotional instability. She was a California native and met Charles within the counterculture scene of the time, becoming a figure susceptible to manipulation and influence from the group's leader. Linda Kasabian, 20, was treated as a key piece for the prosecution because evidence placed her only as a driver and lookout in the Cielo Drive massacre case. She was shaken by the group's actions and agreed to testify against them, which reinforced the prosecution's strategy of separating roles and responsibilities. In the LaBianca case, case, Charles, Patricia, and Leslie Van Houten participated, who was only 19. Like the other members, she had a history of emotional instability and drug involvement, factors cited as part of the context for joining the group. Generally, Susan Atkins's testimony was the central piece for the prosecution because it combined narrative, identification of participants, and description of internal dynamics. Regarding physical evidence, the prosecution revealed that Patricia Krenwinkel's fingerprint was identified on a door inside Sharon Tate's bedroom, establishing her presence at the crime scene. This element was added to point to 2 caliber projectiles found at Spahn Ranch, compatible with the type of weapon used in the Cielo Drive murders. The prosecution's strategy was to bet on the grand jury, leaving Susan to give her full testimony in an organized way with direct usefulness for the legal framing. Notably, sources reported that during the sharing of crime details, she showed no sign of remorse, which was mentioned as a relevant aspect of her behavior. Danny DiCarlo also declared to the grand jury that he, Charles Manson, and Charles Watson had practiced shooting with a .22 caliber revolver at Spahn Ranch. Additionally, he stated that the 3-strand nylon rope used in Sharon Tate's murder had identical characteristics to those available at the ranch, reinforcing the material connection line. Given these elements, Charles Manson, Charles Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Linda Kasabian were indicted on 7 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. Leslie Van Houten was indicted on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy. The legal proceedings were still underway when Rosemary LaBianca's wallet was located in the women's bathroom of a gas station. The object was hidden inside the toilet tank. The prosecution argued it had been placed there by one of the killers themselves. Recovery of this item reinforced the details shared by Susan, who had already mentioned the stolen wallet in her testimony. Even more curious is that the prosecution discovered a high-standard Longhorn .22 caliber revolver with a damaged grip had been turned in to authorities by a civilian. Up to that point, however, the weapon wasn't associated with the case. When tests were done, the prosecution was surprised to discover that weapon was indeed the one used by the group. Regarding the motive for the crimes, the prosecution presented Charles Manson's profile and argued everything revolved around the helter-skelter concept. For the prosecution, he interpreted this as an imminent racial conflict that could be accelerated by violent actions attributed to third parties. The prosecution also stated Charles knew about the property on Cielo Drive due to his brief friendship with Terry Melcher. This connection had reportedly been broken after Charles had his musical proposals rejected by him. For the prosecution, ideological and personal factors may have combined in the motivation for the crimes commanded by Charles. The legal proceedings had Charles's regular presence in court. From time to time, he stole attention through relaxed attitudes or acts of emotional intensity at calculated moments. Some accounts indicate the criminal used to interact with spectators, including members of the press and supporters, using the courtroom environment as a showcase. Even so, the prosecution managed to build a strong case against the Manson family with material evidence, behavioral evidence, and the presence of witnesses considered important. With all this presented, the official trial began in mid-June 1970. In the opening, prosecutor Vincent presented the central thesis of the accusation and described Charles as the mastermind of the crimes. According to the prosecution, although he wasn't present at all the murders, he exercised direct control over the executors. The group acted under his orders and influence. Charles's presence was notably disturbing, and the atmosphere intensified when, during the hearings, he appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead. He also expressed a desire to conduct his own defense, which heightened tensions with the trial proceedings. During the process, the prosecution reported evidence of attempts to interfere with witnesses. One of the most significant episodes involved witness Barbara Hoyt, who reported being threatened and later taken to Hawaii. There, according to her account, she received a high dose of some psychoactive substance. For the prosecution, the case was interpreted as an attempt to prevent her testimony and to intimidate other witnesses. Additionally, Susan Atkins herself, who had given powerful testimony against the Manson family, tried to retract her statements. The effect was contagious. More witnesses altered their confessions, seeking to take full responsibility for the crimes and exclude Charles as the mastermind, but the attempt failed. Throughout the trial, Charlie's behavior became more unstable and harder to contain. Some sources report frequent episodes of interruptions, verbal outbursts, and attempts to divert attention from the trial. On one occasion, there was a direct confrontation with the judge, which resulted in his removal from the courtroom. Curiously, other defendants started similar demonstrations, also resulting in their removal from court at different times. In response, the defense decided not to present witnesses, a decision that opened space for the defendants to claim sole authorship of the crimes as a strategy. Ronald Hughes, one of the lawyers, opposed this line. He would end up disappearing after this. His body would later be found. The official cause of death was attributed to drowning, possibly after a sudden flood in the region where he was camping near Sespe Creek. Authorities concluded he may have been caught off guard by heavy rains and ended up being swept away by the current with no chance to react. Newspapers, on the other hand, encouraged belief from the start in a theory about the Manson family's influence in this, but it was never proven. In mid-January 1971, Charles Manson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten were found guilty of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Charles Watson was tried separately in a later proceeding and also convicted. In the sentencing phase, the jury recommended the death penalty. The sentence was formalized in April 1971 by Judge Charles Older, taking into account the severity of the crimes and the circumstances involved in the overall case. Subsequently, other members associated with the group, including Robert Beausoleil, were also tried and convicted of related crimes, such as the murder of Gary Hinman and ranch hand Shorty, identified as stuntman Donald Shorty Shea. According to findings, Donald was never part of the group, despite having lived alongside them in the ranch environment. In fact, he didn't sympathize with the group's presence at Spahn Ranch, especially with Charles Manson's erratic behavior. There's evidence he even commented that the group was causing trouble and could attract authorities' attention. This position ended up resulting in his murder. In a context of growing conflict, his body would only be located years later in mid-1977 after much investigation and little help from the criminals regarding the location of the remains. According to prosecution records, the case involving the Manson family was one of the longest and most complex trials of its time, lasting more than 9 months, with high costs and extensive media coverage. Another milestone for the case happened in 1972, when the California Supreme Court declared the application of the death penalty unconstitutional in the state. As a consequence, the convicted sentences were commuted to life in prison, ending the possibility of execution. After the case closed, suspicions arose that the group might be involved in other unsolved murders, mainly because Charles frequently confessed to being responsible for more deaths. He avoided naming names, but it was enough to keep investigators alert and in doubt about the real extent of the group's involvement. During his time in prison, various correspondences arrived from Charles Manson fans, among them Afton Elaine Burton, also known as Star, being the most notable. She was an obsessive fan who spent years visiting Charles in prison and publicly defending his innocence consistently. So much so that in mid-2014, they expressed interest in marrying. However, Starr began presenting ideas that were strange even for Charles. Among these ideas was the desire to marry to obtain permission and, in the future, display the criminal's body after death, charging admission for the spectacle. This reportedly caused Charles to lose interest in Starr. Years later, in 2017, Charles Manson would end up dying in his 80s from natural causes. Finally, the horrible legacy of the Manson family crimes becomes a point of observation for the context of the era. This is because at the end of the 1960s, the United States was experiencing the height of counterculture, peace, love, freedom, and breaking of norms. Charles Manson used this ideology to attract and manipulate young people who, without his presence, might never have committed a brutal crime. The fact is that the impact of the Manson family's crimes helped shatter the idea of an era of innocence or peace and brought a collective sense of rupture and insecurity. In that same period, criminals like Ted Bundy began their wave of murders, which similarly would also shake American society. Decades later, Charles's story still appears in books, documentaries, and film. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Tarantino explored the Manson family case. In practice, the director reinterpreted or even corrected the story of the case by constructing an alternative ending. In the film, instead of heading to Sharon Tate's house, the Manson family members end up entering the house next door, where the fictional characters Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Brad Pitt were staying. What happens from there is madness. Unlike in real life, the criminals in the film, when attempting a massacre, are surprised by the protagonists who react by fighting violently and killing the intruders, complete with death by flamethrower and a pit bull attack. All this while Sharon Tate and the others remain safe in the house next door. Tarantino took one of the most disturbing crimes of the 20th century and asked, what if this had a happy ending? But perhaps the best alternative for this story, looking beyond the film, would have been for